Hi everyone, please be sure to have the review sheet for the final exam handy as you listen to this recording. It would also be helpful to have your textbook handy because as I go through the list of bulletin items, I'm going to refer to some of the figures and graphs from the textbook as we move through. So starting with the first item, which is the characteristics of monopoly. Okay, remember this is a case where you have a single seller of a good or service, that the firm's demand curve is the market demand curve for the industry, and that there are no close substitutes for the product. Alright, and when will a natural monopoly develop? Alright, this will often happen when you have a situation when there are large economies of scale inherent, and that the long run average costs are going to fall as the output increases. And sometimes even government will decide that there needs to be a natural monopoly. Like for instance, typically there's like one firm in a jurisdiction that provides the infrastructure for electricity in a particular jurisdiction. And that's because, you know, there are large economies of scale associated with something like that, and quite frankly it would just be too expensive and it would be impractical for multiple firms to be able to provide the infrastructure for electricity. Alright, marginal revenue for the monopolist. Okay, remember that's marginal revenue is going to be less than price, because remember for the monopolist, if they want to sell a greater quantity of output, they're going to have to reduce their price for all the units of output, and therefore remember that the marginal revenue curve is going to sit below the demand curve for the monopolist. So marginal revenue would be less than price for the monopolist. Alright, calculating monopoly profit or loss. Alright, we're looking again for in terms of profit maximization, we're looking for where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Alright, and we're going to look at two figures from your textbook. Alright, this is figures 24-6 and 24-7. These are included on page 543 of your textbook. Alright, first of all, if we look at figure 24-6 on page 543, you have an example of monopoly profit. And you'll notice there in that picture, okay, the quantity that's being produced is at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. So if we move from that point of intersection down to the horizontal axis, you can see that quantity. Alright, and then in terms of how that monopolist is going to price that product, if we move from there up to the vertical axis, up to the demand curve and then over to the vertical axis, okay, we can see the price that's being charged for that quantity, which is labeled as PM. Alright, and then in terms of the average total cost, if we follow that average total cost curve around to that particular quantity of output and then go over to the vertical axis, alright, we can see what the average total cost would be for that particular quantity of output, and we can see in that case that indeed the monopolist would be earning a profit, would be earning economic profits. And then if we look at figure 24-7 at the bottom of the page, again we're looking for the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost that's labeled as point A. Alright, then if we go down from there to the horizontal axis, you can see the quantity that would be produced at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. And in terms of the price that would get charged, if we move from point A up to the demand curve and then over to the vertical axis, we can see the price charged for that quantity of output. And then if we follow the average total cost curve around, okay, to that quantity of output and go over to the vertical axis, we can see the average total cost for that quantity of output. And notice that the average total costs are greater than the price for that quantity of output, and therefore the firm would be incurring economic losses. It's also useful to note in that picture that the average total cost curve sits above the demand curve, alright, in the picture, and that's another clue that that firm indeed would be incurring economic losses. Alright, next item is necessary conditions for price discrimination. Alright, you would have firms would have a downward sloping demand curve. They would be able to identify buyers with different elasticities of demand, and they would be able to prevent resale. So if you think about the firms in the airline industry, alright, they would have a downward sloping demand curve. Buyers would have different elasticities of demand. In other words, think about business travelers. Typically, they have to travel on short notice, and they're willing to pay higher prices for their tickets as compared to, individual consumers who, say someone who's planning a vacation 6 months down the road, they're going to tend to be a whole lot more price sensitive when they're buying their tickets and, they're selecting their flights. But remember that that the firms are able to prevent resale of those tickets. So indeed, they would certainly be able to price discriminate. All right, and then if we compare monopoly to perfect competition, all right, again, it's useful to refer to the textbook. We're going to take a look at Figure 24-9 in your textbook. This is on page 546, and if we look at first of all, at panel A, there in Figure 24-9 on page 546, all right, we have the example of the market demand curve for firms under perfect competition and the market supply curve, and you can see there the quantity of output that's being produced and the price that's being charged in that situation. All right, and then if we look at panel B, we have the situation with the monopolist. All right, and in terms of how much is going to be produced, we're looking at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. All right, you can see that quantity labeled there as QM. All right, the firm is going to charge, all right, based on being able to move from the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. They're going to go up to the demand curve and over to the vertical axis, and they're going to price at a level of PM. And what's significant to notice based on those two pictures is that the monopolist is going to provide a smaller quantity of output, and they're going to charge a higher price, okay, for that quantity of output as compared to what we see in panel A under perfect competition. All right. Let's move from there, all right, to the next item, which is characteristics of monopolistic competition, profit maximization, and whether economic profit is likely in the long run. All right, and firms under monopolistic competition are going to have downward sloping demand curves, but those demand curves are going to be more elastic than what we see for a monopoly. The marginal revenue curve is going to sit below the demand curve, all right, because in order to sell more output, the monopolistic competitor is going to have to lower its price on all units of output that it's selling. So therefore, the marginal revenue curve would indeed sit below the demand curve. But firms in monopolistic competition, they're going to engage in product differentiation. In other words, they're going to be able to try to attach some unique characteristics to their product, whereby they're going to hope to build some loyalty for their product, and they're going to hope that people like their product, they're going to come back to be repeat buyers, and therefore they're going to have a little bit more control over the price at which they sell their product. They're going to be able to try to sell their product at a little higher price based on that product differentiation. But in terms of profit maximization, okay, they're going to be looking for where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. All right, and with all that, it's helpful to be able to look at a graph from the textbook. So we're going to take a look at Figure 25-1 in the textbook. This is on page 559 of the textbook. All right, let's first of all look at panel A, and you'll notice that the firm, okay, they're going to produce at the level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's labeled as point A. If you go down to the horizontal axis, you can see the quantity, okay, at that level of output. All right, the firm is going to go up to the demand curve and then over to the vertical axis to price, all right, that quantity of output. And then you can see as well, all right, in terms of the average total cost, we follow that average total cost curve around to that quantity of output and then go over to the vertical axis. You can see the average total cost, all right, for that quantity of output. And indeed, in that case, since the price is greater than the average total cost, all right, the firm would be earning economic profits. All right, then if we look at panel B, okay, again, we're looking for the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal costs. All right, you can see that's labeled as point A. If we go down to the horizontal axis, you can see the quantity that would be produced. All right, and then if we go up to the demand curve and over, you can see the price that would be charged. All right, and then if we follow that average total cost curve around to that quantity of output and go over to the vertical axis, you can see the average total cost for that quantity of output, and you'll notice there indeed that the average total costs exceed the price for that quantity of output, so therefore the firm would be experiencing economic losses. It's also useful to note there that the average total cost curve, that the entire curve sits above the demand curve, and that's also a clue that the firm is encountering economic losses. All right, and then if you notice in panel C, all right, again, intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost is labeled as point A. We can see that quantity of output. We can see that in terms of the price, that if we go from point A up to the demand curve and over, okay, we can see the price that's being charged. And then in turn, if we follow that average total cost curve around to that quantity of output and go over to the vertical axis, we can see the average total cost for that quantity of output. And we can see there that the price is equal to the average total cost. In other words, you have a situation in that case where economic profits would be zero, all right, in that case. All right, but it's useful also to note here that with respect to panel A, that when firms are earning economic profits, that would encourage other firms to enter that industry, and therefore, you know, as more firms tend to do that, we would tend to see that economic profits would tend to fall towards zero again. In other words, we would tend to see a situation like we see in panel C. And then likewise in panel B, if firms are earning economic losses, all right, they would tend to leave the industry. All right, and then eventually, you know, you would tend to see a situation, all right, that were to happen, that you would get back to where firms were earning zero economic profits, and again, that's illustrated based on what we see in panel C. All right, the next item there is, all right, the experience goods, search goods, and credence goods. Remember, experience goods are ones that you have to consume, all right, to determine what you think about them. And the example in the handout that I gave you was the Easter candy that I brought in for the students in my face-to-face class. All right, a search good would be something that you try out before you buy it. Like, in other words, you could sample a song on Apple iTunes before you actually decide to download it and buy it. And with credence goods, all right, that's the type of good that you may need some expert help or advice to determine the integrity or credibility of that particular good. And remember, the example that I gave you was with Lucy and Charlie Brown, that in other words, that Charlie Brown may have been well served by having an expert to help him to realize that Lucy was not going to be able to provide him with quality psychiatric help, but she just didn't have the appropriate credentials to be able to do so. All right, horizontal mergers is where you have a merger of two firms in the same industry, and we have a discussion posting related to that where American Airlines and U.S. Airways are trying to merge together. All right, so two firms in the same industry that are trying to merge. All right, and the next item there is why do oligopolies exist? All right, they exist because of economies of scale. And the most common reason that oligopolies exist is really because you have barriers to entry. In other words, let's take an example. Let's say good example of an oligopolistic industry would be the automobile industry. All right, and you probably know to be able to set up an auto manufacturing plant would require a lot of money to be able to do so, and there would be a lot of high fixed cost associated with that. So what you would want to do is you would want to be able to produce a lot of cars to be able to spread those fixed costs over a large quantity of output. In other words, to be able to achieve some economies of scale. All right, and another example of an oligopolistic industry would be the steel industry, all right, in addition to the auto industry. All right, the next item there is to calculate a four-firm concentration ratio. All right, you have an example of that in your textbook. This is on page 576, all right, of your textbook. So on the test, if you were asked to calculate such a ratio, be sure you're comfortable in terms of doing that, and I would just take some time to refer to that example to make sure you're comfortable with doing that particular calculation. All right, next item is negative sum game, and this is a situation where players as a group lose, okay, during the game. In real life, an example of something like that might be, all right, let's say you have two countries that are engaged in, that have a disagreement. And you have some diplomats who are sitting in a room and they're trying to resolve the disagreement so that ultimately the countries don't engage in some type of military conflict. Well, let's say that the diplomatic efforts break down and that results in some type of military conflict between the countries. Well, the military conflict itself wouldn't necessarily be, the negative sum game, but if we think about, the failure of the diplomatic efforts, in that particular case, each side is going to lose. So therefore, we say that, when those efforts break down, you have an example in that case of a negative sum game. All right, the next item is the prisoner's dilemma. All right, and you have an example of that that's covered in some detail on page 578 of your textbook. So make sure to take a look at that. It's also important to keep in mind what a dominant strategy is. Remember, dominant strategies are ones that always yield the highest benefit. In other words, regardless of what other players do, a dominant strategy would yield the most benefit for the player that uses it. All right, next bullet is cartels. All right, and this is where firms collude together. Now, in the United States, in most cases cartels would be illegal. But this is where the members, they're restricting output, and by doing so, they're trying to charge a higher price, for that output. All right, but there would be incentives for firms in the cartel to cheat. And because of that, cartels tend to be more successful when there are a small number of firms in play, where they're selling an undifferentiated product, where there are easily observable prices, and where there's little variation in those prices. All right, next item is network effects and oligopolies. And what's important about this point is that, all right, there can be, both positive and negative market feedback. And whether that feedback is indeed positive or negative, remember that oligopolists are strategically interdependent. So, what's happening with one of them, the feedback that one of them is getting is likely going to affect others, in that particular industry. And what's important there again is that they are strategically interdependent. All right, the federal agency that oversees workplace health and safety, remember that's your Occupational Safety and Health Administration, better known as OSHA. All right, next item, natural monopolies in pricing. What happens if they were forced to price as a perfectly competitive firm would versus average cost pricing? All right, a picture in your book will help a lot with that particular item. And this is figure 27-2. This is on page 598 of your textbook. So if we take a look for that, take a look at that for a moment. All right, the natural monopolist, would like to price based on what's illustrated in panel A. In other words, all right, notice, all right, the intersection of the marginal revenue and the long-run marginal cost curve is labeled as point A. So they would want to produce, all right, that quantity of output, and they would want to charge, all right, if we go from point A up to the demand curve and over to the vertical axis, they would want to charge a price that's labeled as PM for that particular quantity of output. All right, but let's say that government wants that natural monopolist to produce a greater quantity of output. All right, so therefore let's look at panel B. All right, so in this particular case, all right, they're going to produce at the level where the demand curve intersects, all right, with the long-run marginal cost curve. All right, and that's labeled as point B. And you can see that quantity of output, on the horizontal axis, that's labeled as Q1. So in other words, they're going to be encouraged to provide a greater quantity of output. However, if they were to price, all right, at a level, where price is equal to marginal cost, all right, you can see that's labeled there as at P1. All right, so if they priced at that level where price was equal to marginal cost, all right, notice, all right, that long-run average cost curve. If we follow it around to that particular quantity of output, we can see the long-run average cost for that particular quantity of output. All right, so, if they priced like a perfectly competitive firm would, where price equals marginal cost, all right, well, they're going to incur losses in that particular case. So then they're not going to want to stay in the game, in that particular type of situation. All right, so what often will occur is that they will be allowed, the natural monopolists will be allowed to engage in what's called average cost pricing. All right, that's where they're able to charge a higher price, and that higher price would provide them a normal rate of return, okay, on their investment. All right, next item is, all right, the lemons problem. All right, and this is a case where, all right, what's important about this item is that you're dealing with a case whereby the different sides have asymmetric information. All right, and a good example of that would be where, say, a used car is being sold. You often have asymmetric information between the buyer and the seller of the car. In other words, the seller of the car knows more about the car than the buyer would. Okay, so therefore, you know, we say that there is that unequal balance of information, you know, between the buyer and the seller. It tends to be asymmetric. All right, the next item there is the capture hypothesis. And this is a case where the regulators are controlled by the regulated firms and their special interests. In other words, you know, the government regulators are actually selected. Okay, they choose people from the firms that they're ultimately going to regulate because they already have experience in those particular kinds of industries. And what can be problematic about that is because, you know, these people are coming from those industries, is they're likely to set regulations that tend to be favorable, okay, toward those industries, and maybe overly favorable toward those industries. And a good example of a case where this exists would be in the nuclear industry. In other words, there is indeed government regulation of nuclear power companies, but those regulators tend to come from those nuclear power companies because they have a lot of experience in those industries. All right, the next item is market share test for monopoly power. Okay, if a firm has a 70% market share, that's considered to be sufficient to be considered to have monopoly power. Okay, a 70% market share. All right, next item there is to calculate marginal physical product. All right, and again, it's helpful to take a look at the textbook. All right, we're going to look at figure 28-1. That's on page 620 of your textbook. Okay, so moving over to that. All right, you have a nice example there. All right, and for instance, all right, if I look at the total physical product, okay, that a labor input of 6 can produce, and then I look at the total physical product that a labor input of 7 can produce. All right, I see the difference there. Okay, it's 882 for 6 workers and it's 1,000 for 7 workers. So in other words, that difference, that marginal change, okay, in total physical product between what 6 workers can produce and between what 7 workers can produce. All right, that's what I'm considering as my marginal physical product. Okay, so I can see, okay, the difference between, okay, the total physical product for 6 workers and for 7 workers is 118. So I get that extra output by adding 1 additional worker. That's my marginal physical product. All right, and then moving to the next item where I'm asked to calculate marginal revenue product. All right, if I'm dealing with a situation where I have perfect competition, okay, that can be calculated by taking the marginal physical product, all right, times the price of the final product. And if I'm dealing with a situation where I have a monopoly, okay, I'm taking the marginal physical product and I'm multiplying that by the marginal revenue, okay, for the product. But it's important to realize there, okay, that the marginal revenue curve might decline because of diminishing marginal physical product. In other words, that's one of the reasons that can cause a marginal revenue product curve to shift downward. All right, and the next item there, okay, indeed is what causes the marginal revenue product curve in a perfectly competitive market to shift. All right, well, remember that the calculation for marginal revenue product is marginal physical product times the price of the product. So if the marginal physical product is changing, all right, that's going to cause the MRP curve to shift. Or if the price of the final product is changing, that could also cause the MRP curve to shift. And you can see actually that illustrated. This is on page 622 of your textbook. This is figure 28-2. you can actually see that marginal revenue product curve shifting. And again, you know, the reasons why it's going to shift is because you have a change in the marginal physical product, or you have a change in the price of the final product. All right, when will the demand curve for labor shift? All right, it could shift if you have a change in demand for the final product. In other words, if the demand for the final product increases, you need more demand, you need more labor, okay, to produce that final product. So that would increase, you know, the demand curve for labor. If you have a change in labor productivity, in other words, if labor tends to become more productive, we would tend to find that the demand curve for labor would increase. If we have a change in the price of related factors, and here we're talking about substitutes and complements, all right, we would find if there's a change in the price of a substitute, that the demand for labor would change in the same direction. If we have a change in the price of a complement, we would find a change in the demand for labor in the opposite direction. So like for instance, if we're talking about, all right, a substitute for labor might be robots. And let's say the price of robots is becoming more expensive, okay, price is going up. Well, then firms will be less likely to buy robots, and they would tend to increase their demand for human labor. So we would tend to find the demand curve for labor would increase. All right, and let's say we're talking about complementary goods, and let's take an example for this. Let's say we're talking about workers in a Kinko's copy center. All right, complementary good to the workers might be the copying machines. And let's say that the price of the copying machines is going up. Well, if the price of the copying machines is going up, you know, the firm is probably going to be inclined to not buy more copying machines, and in turn, that would tend to decrease their demand for labor. So therefore, we would expect the demand curve for labor to decrease when the complementary good, the copying machines, is increasing. All right, labor supply curve facing a firm in a perfectly competitive labor market. Remember that labor supply curve is going to be horizontal or perfectly elastic. All right, what happens when firms in the U.S. industry outsource some of their production? All right, well, if that's the only thing that's happening, if the U.S. firms are outsourcing, all right, we would expect that U.S. labor demand and the U.S. wages in the industry where the outsourcing is occurring would both fall. In other words, indeed, you know, the demand and the wages in that industry would both decrease. All right, principal determinants of the price elasticity of demand for an input. All right, the factors that would affect that would include the price elasticity of demand for the final product, are the use of substitution of other factors for the input, the portion of total costs that input represents, all right, in the final product, and the adjustment period that's available. All right, next item is, will a monopolist hire more or less workers as compared to an industry under perfect competition? Indeed, they're going to hire less because they're going to produce a smaller quantity of output, and they're going to charge a higher price for that output. All right, next item is, if a firm wants to maximize profits, how much of the variable input should be purchased? All right, again, we're going to look at the textbook for this to be able to help us out. All right, we're going to look at, on page 635, under that heading, Profit Maximization Revisited. All right, remember that the firm is going to try to equate the marginal revenue product with the price of the variable input. So for instance, if we look at the first item there, the firm would try to equate the marginal revenue product of labor, okay, with the price of labor. All right, next item there is closed shop versus union shop. Okay, remember, closed shops are illegal, in other words, where you'd have to be a member of a union in order to be able to get a job, all right, in a firm where a union exists. All right, versus with a union shop, we have union shops in the state of Maryland. This is a case where you don't have to be a member of a union to get a job, but if indeed there is a union in place at that employer and it's a union position, you would be expected to join that union within a certain period of time after coming on board in that job. All right, right to work laws. All right, we tend to see those more so in the southern part of the United States, but this is a case whereby if you get a job for an employer where a union is in place, that you can't be forced to join that union if you choose not to do so. All right, what would increase the demand for union labor? All right, if there is increase in demand for union-made goods, all right, there would be indeed an increase in demand for union labor. If there's increased worker productivity, if the union workers are more productive, that would increase the demand for union labor. All right, and if there is a decreased demand for non-union goods, in turn, that would tend to increase the demand for union-made goods. All right, the main difference between a monopsonist and a competitive buyer of labor. All right, a competitive buyer of labor can hire as many workers as desired at the going wage rate, versus the monopsonist has to raise wages to hire additional workers. So again, the competitive buyer of labor can hire as many workers as desired at whatever the going wage rate is, but the monopsonist has to raise wages in order to hire additional workers. All right, and you have to be able to read a graph showing how many workers a monopsonist will employ and what wage rate the monopsonist will pay. All right, and again, let's look at a figure from the textbook. This is figure 29-6. This is on page 654 of the textbook. All right, and notice here that the number of workers that's going to be hired is going to be at the intersection of the marginal revenue product curve and the marginal factor cost curve, and that's labeled as point A there. So if we go down to the horizontal axis, we can see the quantity of workers that would be hired. All right, but in terms of the wage, okay, that would be paid. All right, if we move up from QM up to the supply curve and then over to the vertical axis, all right, we can see the wage that would be paid for that particular quantity of workers. All right, the next item is the Lorenz curve. All right, and this is getting into material from chapter 30 of your textbook. Just remember for that item that the more bowed the Lorenz curve is, the more income inequality there is in a particular economy. All right, next item there is the impact of human capital investments on wages. Like for instance, an example of human capital investment would be people pursuing higher education, and we would in turn expect that human capital investment to reflect positively on wages. We would expect those wages to increase. All right, next item is Social Security. Okay, a couple of things to remember with Social Security. First of all, it's a pay-as-you-go system. In other words, you and me are paying into the Social Security system, but our payments are actually not going to provide for Social Security for us at some point in the future. Our payments are actually going to provide benefits for current retirees. Remember that the payments to current retirees are not based on need. And then essentially, Social Security really is, a system whereby income is being redistributed from the young to the old. All right, and last bullet there, have income maintenance programs affected poverty levels? And the truth is that over time we have found that they have not. The income maintenance programs really have not affected poverty levels. All right, and as you go through and you're doing your review for the test, if you have additional questions, please be sure to send those questions to me, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions that you may have.